Old School Essentials is in the game. Have you ever wondered what the original D&D was like? Then I got the right game for you. Old School Essentials is based on the very first edition of D&D. I mean, technically speaking, it's based on a basic expert set from 1981, and D&D was already around in the 70s. But do you really want to be the actually guy in the comments? The first iterations of D&D had a plethora of problems and weird design choices though, like the rules being all over the place, low AC being good and high AC being bad, or attack matrices. So, Gavin Norman brought these classic rules back to the future and created Old School Essentials. It's a pretty good representation of the original rules, but he polished them a little, gave them a new shine, and more importantly, made books that are actually usable. So if you want to experience the classic feel, but with modern usability, OSE is the perfect game for you. And remember, in this game you don't fight fair, you fight smart. So let's check it out. And let's start with the usability, because I think this game sets the gold standard for layout. You can see directly inside the cover there's 2 pages dedicated to all kinds of things you might want to reference during a game. Same for the end of the book, by the way. Everything is organized so that no topic takes up more than a double page, usually a single page even. In my last few years of GMing, I've realized how much a bad layout can hinder your ability to run a game before you have actually mastered the system. Especially with games where the rules are all over the place. The actual rules start where most RPGs do. Character creation. If you're familiar with modern D&D, you will find some aspects familiar, but you will realize that OSE is much more rules-light. So let's take a closer look. Even back then, characters had the same 6 attributes that we all know and love. Strength, intelligence, wisdom, dexterity, constitution and charisma. And of course, you roll 3d6 for each of those attributes and apply them in order they were rolled. Yeah, that's how it used to work. Character creation in old school D&D is random and with very little customization, so you will not be able to have a detailed character build. You also usually don't write a super detailed backstory, because characters die at 0 hit points and you have to roll up a new one. So, what would you do if you rolled a character with 1 HP and 5 strength? The high lethality and random characters are something I've learned to love though. Characters earn originality in actual gameplay. What doesn't happen at the table doesn't exist. I think that's kinda cool. Also, once characters manage to actually reach higher levels, they will become those super strong heroes that we know and love from modern editions. Let's continue with class selection. The choices are Cleric, Fighter, Magic User, Thief, Elf, Dwarf and Halfling? Yeah, species used to be a class, and they are very specific. The Dwarf is a frontliner, the Elf is a Wizard Sword Fighter hybrid, and the Halfling is just Halfling. Species as class has some cool implied world building. I don't use it myself though. The advanced fantasy rules have the option to separate species and class, so you can play a dwarf cleric or an elven thief, which is probably for the better if I'm being honest. After rolling attributes and picking class, you roll your HP. If you're unlucky, you're starting with just 1. Yeah, your starting character can really suck in this game. Aside from holding HP, you also pick items, note armor and Tech 0? Tech 0 is a clunky old system that tells you the number you need to hit, and low AC is good while high AC is bad. But don't worry, OSE gives you the option to use modern AC rules, like any reasonable person would. You'll also see that there are no skill lists for characters to pick from, unless you're playing a thief, which is totally different can of worms that could fill its own video really. No skills mean that a lot of situations you'd solve with skill checks in modern D&D have no corresponding roll. You can either roll an ability check where you want to roll a d20 under your attribute value, or you solve it in the fiction, probably without rolling. And I think that's a feature, not a bug. It forces player to tackle problems creatively and think of their character as a real person instead of as a gamepad where you have to press the right buttons. The solution is usually not in your character sheet in this game, and that is good. And you also don't need to roll for liking and subscribing. We could also talk about the saving throws in this game, but I'm just showing you the system, not giving you a guide on how to play. But let it be said, the saving throws are death or poison, wands, paralysis or petrification, breath attacks and spells, or magic rods or staffs. I think this just shows what kind of problems you were supposed to save against in an old school dungeon. And yes, poison is not dealing damage, it's dealing death. Each class also has the option to build a stronghold at high level, by the way, but we are keeping that in mind for later when we talk about domain level play. I've also heard the 2024 version of 5e wants to kinda reintroduce that with bastions. I guess we'll see when the DMG is out, which it is not yet. Now that we've got our characters ready, let's look at what adventuring looks like in OSE. And we'll start with the size of the party, and the perfect one is, according to this book, 6 to 8 characters. If that sounds a lot, don't worry too much. It's expected that you take some hirelings and retainers with you when delving into a dungeon. You decide upon a marching order, so you know who gets hit by the traps and ambushes, and also choose who calls the shots and who maps the dungeon. Yeah, the players are supposed to map the dungeon. Sounds strange at first glance, but I've used it in my games, sometimes, not always, and my players usually liked it. A cool mechanic of this game are wandering monsters, random encounters the GM rolls on when too much time passes. The random encounter tables also include other adventuring parties, which creates tension. This is such a cool concept that makes dungeons and honestly the whole world feel alive, and I'll dive deeper into it in a future video. What happens if wandering monsters appear? Or if the party finds monsters in the dungeon room? The GM rolls how the monsters react, which is influenced by the character's charisma. That's a really cool mechanic, because it can lead to unexpected situations. Picture this. The goblins, they want to team up. They need help getting rid of the ogre. The kobolds, they unpack some wares, ready to wheel and deal. Really cool mechanic, believe me. Also, monsters don't necessarily fight to the death. When their first combat falls, and when half the group is defeated, they roll a moral check to see if they continue fighting or if they will flee, or maybe retreat. That gives the players an edge, because they don't have to roll on morale. The retainers have to roll on loyalty though, or they might, you know, leave. And as mentioned earlier, characters die at 0 hit points. No death saves or anything like that. So, maybe don't get too attached before you reach high level. Your players should really choose when to fight and when to run. Fights are super swingy in this game, so you should only pick fights if you have an unfair advantage, like placing exploding barrels or something like that. So, let's get to more dungeon stuff. Whoa, what's it with this door? Does it have eyes, or what is that supposed to be? Is it a living door? There's even hands. Everything in this dungeon wants to kill you. With traps it's obvious, but doors are supposed to fall shut behind you unless you block them. You have a dedicated listen at door skill, which is always an X in 6 chance. Yup, that's another mechanic that you might find strange. You roll a d6, and if you are at X or lower, you succeed. In actual play it actually works rather well, but some players don't like that mechanics are all over the place. For combat it's a d20, for random stuff it's a d6, and for the thief it's a d100. I'd say that's one of the parts of the game that even the modern version by Gavin couldn't fix. OSE offers solid rules for adventuring, which I wholeheartedly recommend stealing for your modern D&D as well. There's procedures for wilderness and nautical exploration as well, but they are really similar to the dungeon ones, so check them out yourself. There's also tips on designing the wilderness, dungeons and towns. You even get some random tables to fill the rooms with stuff. Really useful no matter what game you're playing. I promised earlier that I'd come back to the Strongholds, and they answer the question that you probably didn't ask. What do you do if your characters become way too strong for delving into dungeons and slaying some monsters? What do you do if the heroes can walk through walls, fly through the whole dungeons, have fireballs that can decimate small armies and enough healing spells to resurrect the whole party? Well, you build your own little kingdom of course, with the Stronghold as its base. Game changes drastically at this point, because you're having low-level guys do the dirty work for you. It's the part that's very RP heavy and also the part of play that OSP players love most, even though they've never actually been in a campaign that got so far. So, with all said and done, what do I think of OSE? Whether you're new to old school gaming or a veteran looking to relive the classics, OSE is a great way to dive in. And hey, even if some routes feel a little dated, that's part of the charm. And the best part? You can hack it, tweak it and make it your own. That's not only an option in the world of the OSR, it's actually encouraged. There are some things that are really too dated though, at least for me. The thief could really use an update, and rolling all those kinds of different dice and on some high is good, on others low is good, that really confuses and honestly infuriates players. But hey, don't just take my word for it. The basic rules are free and I'll put a link to them as well as the books in the description, so check those out. I'll also link the Principia Apocrypha, which is a like 30-page document that explains the OSR style in detail. But I've also made a video about it, which you can watch here. Have you played OSC already? How did it go? Or do you want to try it out now? Let me know in the comments. And I wish you a fun game night and have a great week.